Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes and let people continue to sign in. We have a lot of people signing in right now. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Mindy Mitchell, Director for Individual Homeless Adults here at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Welcome to today's meeting of the Rapid Rehousing for Youth Learning Community. Before we get started, I have just a couple housekeeping tips. First, all participants will be muted except for speakers and panelists during presentations. Second, at any time during the webinar, you can enter questions for speakers into the question box on the right of your screen. We will be gathering your questions throughout the webinar, and the panelists will answer as many of those as they can at the end of all the presentations. Additionally, the webinar and the slides will be made available after the broadcast. Okay, we are thrilled to have a couple of really great panelists today. First, after I provide a little framing, we'll learn about diversion generally from Kay Mosher-McDivitt, a Senior Technical Assistant Specialist here at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Then we'll hear again from Caitlin Rose, Special Projects Manager at New Reach Incorporated in New Haven. We've had so many teaser questions last time for Caitlin about Connecticut's coordinated entry system, in which diversion figures heavily at the front door, that we decided to have her back for this deep dive into the topic that so many learning community members wanted to know more about, diversion. So Caitlin's going to tell us how all of the concepts that Kay teaches about are being put into practice in her community. And after we get a better understanding of diversion from these two knowledgeable speakers, we're going to open up the conversation for your questions. Again, you can submit your questions at any time in the box on the right of your screen. And finally, I'll end up by saying what we're going to have coming up for the rest of this year for the learning community. To get us started, as always, here's just our reminder about what we mean when we say rapid rehousing. It's a housing-first, permanent housing intervention that helps young people find housing, pay for housing, and maintain that housing through voluntary case management services that connect young people to all the community resources that they need to achieve stability. And of course, when we're thinking about why we're doing rapid rehousing for youth, we want to remember how much funding has grown for youth rapid rehousing in the past few years. It's really exploded thanks to the advocacy of innovative youth rapid rehousing providers and young people themselves. And of course, we know that many more young people are being served with COC and ESG funding that is not population specific, especially in the family programs. And these numbers also don't include rapid rehousing funding from other systems like TANF, which again serves many young parents, or the Veterans Administration, the Supportive Services for Veterans Families rapid rehousing program does indeed serve a small number of young vets who are experiencing homelessness. But This other chart here provides the real reason why we want to talk more about youth rapid rehousing. We know from the most recent AHARs that at least half of young people experiencing homelessness on a single night were unsheltered, and we know that's certainly an undercount. We also know that increasing permanent housing options for young people is one of the most important ways that we can increase flow out of homelessness for them. So as we start to think about why rapid rehousing for youth learning community members said they were ready to start exploring more systemic approaches in this year's learning communities, we can look at lessons learned from past years, especially this one at the bottom. Rapid rehousing isn't just a housing model, it's a systemic response to homelessness. And again, what we mean by system is that a system brings together many interdependent parts. They're not all doing the same things. They have different roles and responsibilities. And in an effective system, these parts are all working together with a defined set of resources and practices so that the system knows where the boundaries are, the resources it has to work with, and the primary methods and practices to be used. And all of those things are aligned and working together towards the common goal. In our case, that common goal is an effective homelessness response system where the components are aligned with all the other components and help young people quickly exit homelessness. Another important thing to think about when we're developing a systemic response to youth homelessness is funding. Resource scarcity is a real thing. And as you can see from these pie charts, even though the fiscal years are a couple years behind, the numbers have not changed that much. Our slice of the federal budget pie, this is discretionary spending. So every year we end up lobbying Congress about this money. This little piece of the pie here makes this big circle here. And then within this pie, just this tiny bit here, only 6% of discretionary spending is for the Housing and Community Development Block Grant, where the HUD homeless programs sit. And just the COC and ESG funding within that small percentage is only about 3% of the budget, about 5% of the budget, sorry. So you can see that we have to be really smart about how we're targeting homelessness resources. And all the talk about resource allocation brings me to another relevant framing that I wanted to hit on quickly for today's conversation. Since there's so much misinformation out there about HUD's definition of homelessness, I wanted to take this opportunity to just remind us all that all of these different types of homelessness and housing instability experiences are already included in HUD's definition. Though, as you can see, people are eligible for different things based on their housing crisis. A really important part of this eligibility flowchart for today's purposes, though, is the big yellow pentagon of all the local, state, federal, and private resources that we need to be thinking about when we're mapping out our systemic response to homelessness. How are we making sure that young people are getting connected to all of those resources? Those connections are a vital part of the coordinated community response to prevent and end homelessness for young people. Okay, now that we've all got our systems lenses on, I'm happy to pass things along to my awesome colleague, Kay Mosher-McDivitt, who's going to give us the what, why, when, and how of diversion. Okay, Kay, take it away.
So I had to unmute myself. I'm not used to being muted and like talking and realized, oh, I'm muted. Hi, everybody. As Mindy said, I'm Kay Mosher-McDivitt. I'm part of the Center for Capacity Building team here. And if you're not aware of what we do, we're the arm of the alliance that goes out across the country. We look at what's happening in communities. We look at best practices, and then we take what we know and we go into other parts of the country to help them implement this. And so diversion is certainly one of the things that has been out there. I think just by the very fact that we had more people sign up for this webinar than we've had sign up for a majority of the webinars. And even when we did our emergency shelter learning series, if you're a shelter, we have a whole learning series on our website. And when we did, the role of shelters in diversion, it again was one of the highest attended webinars that we had. So clearly this is one of the things that people are just trying to get their arms around. So I'm going to go through and try to give a little bit of clarity. Again, this is taken from when we go into communities, we spend 2 days working and training on how to do systemic diversion. So, in 15, 20 minutes here, you're just going to get, a little tiny slice of what this is, but I'm going to try to give some basics on the what, the why, the when, and the how. So Mindy, next slide. And I also want to say that I'm going to sort of do this higher overview, and then Caitlin will give some more specific examples of how you really implement this in your community. So this whole question about what the heck are we talking about when we talk about diversion? So here is the Alliance's definition. Diversion is a strategy that helps people identify and access safe alternatives to homelessness and resolve their immediate housing crisis. What we want to do is make sure that even if somebody is knocking at that shelter door, that doesn't mean that shelter is their only alternative. And so we want to make sure that we're creating the best system flow and finding a way to resolve people's crises in case we can find a solution that's not shelter. So, many times people might have a better option to shelter, but they end up filling shelter beds that could actually be better used for someone that might have a lot more urgent needs. And we also know that shelters, and I'm assuming your community is like most communities, that shelters just don't have the capacity to accommodate everyone who asks for shelters. And we hear that shelters have long wait lists to get into shelter, but we also know that this whole thing then goes into the whole queue for the entire coordinated entry of the system, is that then there's long wait lists for every intervention. And so we know that we've got to do something because not everybody, we don't have enough stuff for everybody. Mindy already talked about that, our funding for homelessness is like 5% of the total HUD budget on the housing and homeless services side, which is part of this whole discretionary funding. So, we have this tiny little slice of pie. So how can we make sure we use it in the best way? So the next slide. So we could spend like a whole webinar or, like I said, a whole day talking about how to implement diversion. And I'm going to say that staff really should really get more intense training on implementing diversion. But today I'm going to just provide this overview of what diversion is. And like I said before, then Caitlin's going to spend more time talking about specifics in youth diversion. But ultimately, diversion is going to prevent homelessness for people seeking shelter by helping them find a safe alternative housing arrangement, a housing solution, and maybe can help them stay where they are if it's safe and appropriate, but resolve some of the issues that led that person to the shelter door. So I want to say again that diversion is not a program, it's a service. And so when people think they have to sort of get funding to start this whole separate program arm, absolutely don't do that. You'll see the third bullet here. Diversion is not a separate program. It's part of the entire crisis response system. But again, it's not a denial of services. It's not a denial of shelter entry. It's not a barrier to shelter entry. What we are trying to do through diversion is expand options to identify alternatives to coming into shelter. Financial assistance, while it's a piece that if you can get flexible assistance, it's really good. But what we're learning is that it's often unnecessary to successfully divert somebody from shelter and help them find an alternative solution. And I think, one of the things that we know, and especially if we come from the social work background, is that, problem solving is what this is all about. It's like literally looking at a way to solve the current crisis that person is in, but always making sure that it's safe and appropriate for the person or household seeking help. But again, remember that diversion should happen like at the coordinated entry process especially if your coordinated entry process is before the front door of shelter. We know that for some communities that the coordinated entry process is more coordinated entry into a permanent housing option and not about into the homeless system. So if that's where it is, then it's at the shelter door. So if you are operating a shelter, you may end up needing to think about how do we become diversion specialists when somebody is calling for shelter. Next slide. So, this whole diversion thing. So one of the things is that I just want us to remember is that when you look at the youth that you're working with, if you look at youth across the country that are struggling with the same issues that the youth that are touching the homeless system do, they don't look that different. A lot of youth are experiencing a housing crisis, and yet a majority of those youth never become homeless. And what we've learned also is that targeting homeless resources to those sort of traditional prevention strategies, and particularly on the youth side, because often it's like eviction prevention, which is not where youth usually come from. And we've just learned that doesn't really reduce homelessness. So it was like, okay, then what's next? So next slide. So why do we really need to do this? What we know is that if we can help somebody avoid homelessness, avoid a shelter stay, it's going to really improve the quality of life, because coming into shelter, no matter how good your shelter is, how successful you've been in finding people, housing or having successful results for your folks, it is still incredibly stressful to come into shelter, no matter what your shelter looks like. And we know that it's very traumatic for people to experience a shelter stay. And if we can help somebody avoid that, most folks come to us because they're already stressed out. They're already experienced some trauma when they're coming asking for shelter. But shelter does not decrease that. It only adds to that. And we also have to remember that shelter is not a door to a housing subsidy. And I think through the coordinated entry efforts, and Caitlin can maybe talk to this, is that there was sort of this perception that people got, people in the community had this idea, well, if I can get my person into shelter, then they're going to get rapid rehousing, or they're going to get a voucher, or they're going to go get a PSH slot. And reality is that probably less than 20% of people that come into shelter will ever have access to anything that the system has, because there's just simply not enough. And so we need to make sure that we're using our resources for the most vulnerable. And you can see this even conserving and targeting resources, using shelter beds for those with the higher needs that don't have any other alternatives. We just want to make sure that we don't have a bunch of people sitting on wait lists when, somebody's in a shelter bed that had we had this conversation with them, perhaps they wouldn't have needed that shelter bed. And then in addition, it's even that next step, like how do we conserve our resources for those that have the highest need, because there simply is not enough. And we know that for, about 80% of people that come into shelter, they're going to exit shelter with nothing. They're not going to get a subsidy. They're not going to get rapid rehousing. And so how can we use what we know from even rapid rehousing interventions and other things to problem solve and help people find an alternative solution? I often call it a housing situation, because, permanent housing it's not the same thing for everybody. So how do we really look at that? And I think finally, it really does improve system performance outcomes by reducing new entries and reentries into homelessness. Because again, even if somebody's, been homeless before, what we know is that if folks, will often have a housing crisis, they'll come right back into shelter. But if we can start that diversion process the second time around, maybe we can resolve it so that we don't have as many reentries back into the shelter system. But first-time homelessness is also the one thing we're looking at reducing. All right, next one. So how do you determine when diversion strategies should be used? So now we're getting into the when, as opposed to other types of intervention. And a lot of people are sort of thinking, okay, what's the difference between prevention and diversion and, rapid exit services? So if you look at this chart, it shows the differences between traditional prevention, what we are talking about today, which is diversion, and then housing-focused rapid exit services, which can include rapid rehousing and PSH, but it may be a lot more than that. So at the right, you see all the types of services that can be provided and should be available within all of these strategies, all of these interventions. So the services don't look different. It's just where and how we provide them. And so if the goal of an effective homeless response system, which we hope yours is to resolve a person's housing crisis at every opportunity, whether they're at risk of homelessness or they're seeking shelter, the reality is that the types of services can look very much the same. But we would say that service, the first two services at the top of that list on your right, creative problem-solving conversation and conflict resolution, are probably the critical parts of what makes successful diversion happen across systems. Next slide. So I also wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of like, okay, so what are we talking about? So before shelter intake and shelter entry, so at coordinated entry, if that's before shelter, if somebody's coming to shelter, before we sit down and just do that coordinate or that intake with somebody, this is the way we start changing questions. So on the right are sort of the kinds of traditional things that we do. Here's our rules and regulations. Are you eligible? What are the determinations of that? Can you follow everything that we want? Are you willing to participate in our shelter? And then we have these screening tools and assessments. And often we very seldom have a shelter bed, right? So somebody just gets put on a wait list. What we want to do is move to what's on the right. So as you start thinking about how do we just get started in doing this, is that if everybody across your system would start coming together and saying, how do we start having these conversations? Like talking about, like, do you feel safe? And I often say, don't ask a yes or no question, so that we took this from some materials that we had seen out there. I would say not is the place you're staying safe, but how do you feel in the place you're staying? Is it a safe place to stay? Is more of a yes or no versus like how does it feel to be there? But then again, all of the other questions are open-ended. What would resolve your current housing crisis? And then start really brainstorming and having some really structured problem-solving conversations about those situations and the resources. And again, what you want to do is try to avoid whenever possible a shelter entry if there's another option, because what we know is in the communities, and I think, Caitlin, you'll talk about this, is that when we start really doing this diversion and having a system that's very implementing diversion strategies across their system, is that we really can see a reduction in first-time homelessness. We can really see that folks can come up with other solutions, and they don't come back to shelter and ask very often. Sometimes folks do, but it doesn't mean that you don't at least start with that. Okay, next one. So this is like an is and an isn't. So what diversion is or isn't is on the right-hand side. I just wanted to reiterate this again, sort of to think about when to use this is, again, it's not a separate program, so it's part of the system. So wherever people are touching the system, and if with youth, you've got a system where, youth are touching in a variety of places before they enter the homeless system, this is where we start having these conversations. And remembering that it is problem solving and solution focused and should be safe and appropriate. What we really want to make sure you realize is it really needs to be part of whatever your coordinated entry process is, and it needs to be before the shelter front door. You also need to have resourceful staff, and here's some of the trainings we think you should really be focused on, and also have some really good linkages to mainstream services and natural support. So start thinking through, who are those mainstream resources that we need to connect to? Mindy showed you that on the chart, is that part of diversion is thinking about all these other linkages that need to be there that we can help people access. And then we say access to flexible funds, but I just wanted to add that, while we say it's a requirement, something you should have, what we've learned is in a majority of cases when staff get, you can't see me, I am pointing to the screen right now, and I'm circling this resourceful staff training. When you have staff that are trained well and doing this well, what we've learned is that the dollars are not as important as the problem-solving conversations. So we've seen communities that just really don't have flexible funding, but they still start the conversations and still are having some success, even without flexible funding. So don't wait for dollars to get started. Next slide. So the one thing we want to make sure is that, in the early days of talking about diversion, it was sort of like, okay, well, we're going to have this problem-solving conversation, and if we can't come up with safe alternatives, the person goes to shelter, and then it's business as usual. What we're going to want to say is that when diversion is not appropriate, when there is not a safe alternative, when we can't, leverage anything outside of that, we want to make sure that upon shelter entry is that we still have those same strategies, effective problem solving, all the blue language on here, that we have these client-centered, housing-focused creative solutions so that we continue those. And I've even heard of folks that sometimes they end up putting people on a wait list, and people were on the wait list. So, and I think, Caitlin, I don't know if I'm right about this, but it seems to me that maybe New Haven was where you guys went to the shelter wait list and started really, and so you can talk about this, but somebody in Connecticut went to their shelter wait list and realized people were just sitting there, and the diversion specialist started contacting everybody that was on that wait list on a regular basis to continue to have those conversations, and were able to really eliminate that wait list. And I'm thinking it may have been the New Haven area, but I think that's the way to really think about this. Is an ongoing process. It's not like, oh, well, we did this and it did, we couldn't come up with anything, or it didn't work, however you term it. And so now we're done. These conversations are never done. It's an ongoing thing. Remember, I said that only about 20% of people in shelter are going to be able to get an intervention like rapid rehousing, some kind of PSH, subsidized housing, or a voucher. So reality is that for 80% of the folks that come into shelter, they're going to come up with a housing situation or solution through this problem solving. So the last thing I want to do, next slide, is really talk about sort of the ABCs. We've come up with 4 fundamentals of effective diversion practice, and I am not going to go into the practice. Caitlin's going to really provide more detail on these 4 fundamentals, but these things, when we've talked to communities, when we went out and really looked at communities, there were these common themes across communities that were successful. First of all, you have to have this community-wide buy-in. There needs to be this understanding that this is not a rejection of service. It's not a denial of service. It's not a bad thing. This is really about the identification of something better than our homeless system and a shelter. And then the second thing is, you've heard me say it how many times already, these problem-solving conversations are just one of the most critical pieces of it. No, just go back. Okay. And then continuous practice. Mindy's getting ahead of me. And then the continuous practice. So now go to the next slide. So community-wide buy-in, right? So this is, to talk a little bit more, this is where you want to get, community-wide and shelter staff buy-in is really critical to the successful implementation of diversion strategies. So the focus across the system should be that homelessness is a crisis, and that everyone is assisted in solving that housing crisis. This is not about a score where if you score this, you get this, and not this. And it's not even about as much, if you're eligible, then you get this and this and this. Even with that entire chart that Mindy showed you, before you start thinking about that, you should be having these problem-solving conversations. And also this real buy-in that shelter's not the solution to ending someone's homelessness, and that, these alternative ideas that we come up with, and the fact that clients are often, those folks that come to us, the youth that come to us, may actually be the best captains of their ship. Sometimes we think we are, and reality is that often we're not. And we really have to allow the strengths of that person to come through and identify what's going to work for them. So Caitlin, I'm really going to let you talk a little bit more about that. And then the problem-solving conversation, next slide. It's really, again, these are some of the conversations. Make sure they're realistic. Discussions on any type of, housing they may have had in the past, any resource they might have, anybody they might know, what's worked for them, any connections they may have, and really think through any creative solutions and looking at every possible option. There is not a diversion screening tool. There is not a list of questions that you should ask. This is literally a conversation. And, but you ask all these kinds of things. Sometimes it might be just a food security thing that whoever somebody is living with is that they're really struggling paying bills and having some issues with food, and sometimes getting that whole household connected could allow that youth to stay with that household longer, whether it's family or friends. And it's really about staff time. It's really more of a time thing that staff have the time to really spend time in these creative solutions. And I think it's also making sure that sometimes we have to explain the realities of shelter life. And I actually heard this from another youth provider that says, it's just not, shelter's not a great place. And a lot of times your day-to-day choices are removed. There's curfew. There's just a lot of things that have to happen in shelter just because you have a lot of people living together. And whatever that reality is, letting folks know that it's not the best thing, because even outside of the helping profession, who sometimes sort of has adopted that getting my client in shelter is going to help them get something, even folks in the community sort of have picked that up, that maybe there's this idea that, I heard if I get into shelter, I can get something, and people don't really get what it's like to live in shelter. And you want to just make sure you say that, additionally, if you get into shelter, you're probably not going to get any help with housing other than the same thing I'm doing, because there's not those resources available. Next slide. The third C then is creating connections. The homeless response system cannot do it all, which is why, again, that little block in the bottom of Mindy's chart, we have got to start really working with the other resources that are out there and get other people to step up and do the kinds of things that they need to do. The second bullet, though, I want to say is that there are natural supports, and those natural supports are just so critical for effective implementation of diversion strategies. And I think sometimes we start thinking about all the mainstream providers as diversion strategies, but we have learned in a majority of cases that often it's the friends, the family, connections through jobs, other people that are not part of the helping profession, are not part of the mainstream services, that are the solution, and not the public kinds of solutions that we think of. And the warm handles are a must. And, whether you're, even resolving, but sometimes you're doing mediation, with a family or a friend or a situation to resolve something, because you don't just say, well, just try to stay there if you can. You pick up the phone and you try to resolve whatever situation brought that person to you. And then the next slide. So the last one I'm going to talk about, and I'm winding up here, is this continuous diversion practice. Just making sure that you know that even if somebody comes a second time, just because you've done it once and it seems like work, coming a second time doesn't mean you just stop. The other thing is you might want to try to do some follow-up. If you come up with a solution, call that person in a week or two, see how it's going, text them, do an email, have some kind of connection just to make sure that they know that you're still there to check in with them if it can be helpful. And then the final slide, I think this is the final one. So Mindy, just keep clicking. So these are just the kinds of things that, maybe it's like somebody had a breakdown with their family and they can go back. Maybe they can permanently go back with another family or friends. Maybe they're, just temporarily diverted while we're seeking something more permanent. Or maybe there's a safe place out of your community that somebody can go to. There's a lot of others, but we just wanted to say that there's not one solution and there's not one successful outcome. There's a variety of them. And the next slide. So I think I just want you to remember that there's a lot of folks, a lot of youth that face a housing crisis, but actually there's a lot less that become homeless even when it looks like they do. And so this problem-solving conversation that can really focus on strengths of alternatives to shelter is it's just incredibly important as long as it's safe. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mindy and Caitlin.
Thanks, Kay. I really appreciate the overview of diversion. We have already had lots of questions, and I just want to remind everyone that Kay and Caitlin will be responding to your questions at the end of both of these presentations. So, of course, please do continue to enter your questions in the box on the right of your screen. Next up, now that we have this better general understanding of diversion, we're going to hear from another awesome speaker about implementing diversion and how that happens at the local level. Caitlin Rose from New Reach in New Haven, Connecticut is going to tell us all about it. Caitlin, you are up, and I believe you are unmuted on my end.
All right, great. Thank you so much again for having me back. It's a pleasure to speak with you. We'll go ahead to the next slide. As Mindy said, I am from New Reach. We're a CARF-accredited nonprofit aimed at inspiring independence for those affected by homelessness through our continuum of housing resources and support. We're in Greater New Haven and Fairfield counties in Southern Connecticut, and I do oversee some diversion services here in Greater New Haven. I work very closely with the state at large on some of this, and I actually worked for many years in Los Angeles County with youth experiencing homelessness in diversion services. So I'm going to be pulling in a bit of that perspective today as well as I present. Next slide. So housing first. I'm going to do a lot of really diving deeper into a lot of things that Kay said because she teed me up really beautifully. We really want to respond to housing crises among young people with a housing first attitude and keeping in mind that some of the housing first principles really need to be developmentally appropriate. Young people often have options that are better for them than shelter, but might be having difficulty in the moment identifying and parsing out what some of those options are. There's really a strong framework to hold here on how we discuss shelter with young people and kind of things that we know to be true. And entering shelter, as Mindy had kind of explained, is entering literal homelessness, right? And there's an impact on brain development throughout all of the trauma that's accompanying a housing crisis and accompanying shelter entry, and could be potentially traumatic. And so we really have an opportunity here to keep adolescent brain development in mind, to really think about what somebody might have as resources, and again, help them come through with that plan and really help them work through what have they tried already, who are folks that know what's going on with their homelessness, who's helped you out in the past, who referred you to call 211 and come to us today, and really just opening up that conversation in a really kind of calm and patient way, and really make sure that the conversation you're having with a young person is not an emotions-based processing. We really want to go slowly and go rationally through what some of the options are that young people have in front of them, weighing pros and cons, and then ultimately holding the line of shelter eligibility. I think all communities are like this, that we don't have the resources for a young person to enter shelter and get matched to a housing resource. And there is definitely some community education that we've had to really dispel some of the myths about shelter entry amongst all populations. And I'll get a little bit more into community coordination in a bit. But we really want to coordinate with the young person and also whoever those resources are. If somebody says they've been staying with a friend and their mom and their friend's mom won't let them stay anymore, I invite them to be a part of the conversation. As Kay mentioned, if there's a resource that we can provide for that family to keep that young person with committed adults and companions that care about them and that are committed to supporting them, we want to facilitate that as much as possible, because we know that there are going to be young people who come to our door that really don't have other options, that have barriers, that have led them to really need an outside intervention outside of their community. And we want to make sure that we have a response for them as soon as possible when those folks arrive at our door. We want to preserve relationships for young people that they already have in place, and we want to reserve our resources. Next slide. So how do we discuss some of this, right? We really want to make sure for the staff that are having these conversations, we really want to pay attention to trauma-informed care. The little things that we do that can make or break these important conversations are just so important. Make sure the ringer of your phone is off and that it's not going off on your table. Be clear and transparent about what a young person's coming in for. A lot of times I've gotten feedback the young people are there because someone sent them to a CAN appointment or sent them to a drop-in center to talk about housing, but they don't necessarily know what they're in for. So really kind of setting the framework that, you're there to help hear them out, figure out how you can be of assistance to them, and you won't actually know what that's going to look like until you ask them questions. And I always really encourage my supervisees that, there's not really a hard and fast script on some of this. We do have some questions that we know we like to ask because it helps pull for resources. But if you're facilitating an intake, through HMIS or whatever your data management system is, you don't need to stick to that script, right? It's a dialogue that you're having with somebody, and the relationship that you can build with that young person in front of you is really going to help you glean more information. That's really going to help you be able to get the most out of the interaction that you have. You really want to capitalize on a connection, if possible, because again, you're going to be asking some pretty vulnerable questions from time to time. And there's a lot of guilt and shame that accompanies young people that are having to step up and ask for help, particularly from a stranger and particularly from a strange system. So I always encourage folks to really rely on whatever personal conversational style you have to really, utilize that, because you want to make a connection as soon as possible. And make sure, especially if this is a client that, has never come through the system before, that they really feel like they understand what you're asking and why. Next slide. So, I always say that motivational interviewing is really a cornerstone of any interaction. But I think really specifically in diversion, it's really important to have this in your back pocket. It can be a little bit difficult to practice motivational interviewing sometimes with young people that maybe don't have the same level of self-introspection, but it is a really great habit to have, working with using motivational interviewing when you're talking to young people, so that you're coming to a consensus about a plan. I bring this up sometimes, specific examples are, I work with young people that have a safe housing opportunity and they don't want to return to it. Sometimes that's location-based, right? A young person wants to live in a certain location, and to have to go back to Ohio to live with mom feels like a setback. Or young people would like, they want to be grown and they want to be on their own and be adults, and they have had some missteps. So it's really important to be able to rely on motivational interviewing to keep them focused on both the short and long-term housing goals for them, and let them know really what some of the opportunities are in front of them and what some of the options are that you can hold. Because shelter might not be an option, but the goal of stable housing for them is certainly something that you want to support and that you really want to make sure that you're working on the same page with. Next slide. So what are you asking? I think the main things that you're wanting to ask about, and the main thing to keep in mind, is you're not focusing just on housing. You certainly want to ask a young person about where they've been staying and get kind of a sense of the trajectory of what's going on with their housing. But you also really want to be strength-based and pull for resiliencies. If somebody is 19 and they've graduated high school, that's a great opportunity to congratulate them. That's a resiliency factor. That's huge. That can also lead to a conversation of, are you interested in going back to school? Have you had a job before? When was the last time you worked? It's showing an interest in them, and it's also building a conversation piece around these things that are larger than just their housing crisis. It also might help you identify some referrals and resources to support them using community support. And it also can help build this longer-term plan that even if the young person's not eligible for shelter, they have somewhere to go, and we might be able to just stabilize them back within their family or friends. Inevitably, we also want them to feel like they've got some pointers on how to move forward and some self-sufficiency. A lot of times youth present seeking shelter because they're really looking for a next step to launch into adulthood and are not really sure where to go. So again, there's no set script, but I think if you're focusing your conversation around resiliencies and risk factors, then you're probably on the right track. I do have a link to the State of Connecticut's Coordinated Entry Toolkit, and it kind of goes through the way that we frame some of our questions. Again, we've consulted with young people on how to ask some of these things. But I think the main thing is if you're going to ask a personal question, you want to make sure that you're linking it back to something that you can provide for the young person. It otherwise feels like we're doing an assessment. And you really want it to feel as conversational as humanly possible, because you want it to be rapport building and you want the young person to leave with more resources than they came with. Next slide. So I know in our community here in Connecticut, we've really prioritized a lot of our resources for literally homeless young people, as well as young people that are Category 4, fleeing something unsafe, whether it's domestic violence or sex trafficking. And assessing safety is going to look, again, a little bit different, really depending on what a young person feels comfortable in sharing. So diversion plans and housing assessments really need to consider safety through the lens of what the young person identifies. And we also really need to be specific on how we're asking questions to be able to pull this information. So I had a really great example in working on some assessment questions, and the question was, do you exchange sex for food or a place to stay? And the young person said, well, I exchange sex for rides. And that's not what you asked me, right? So there's a way that sometimes you have to really be very specific on what you're asking, and you also want to be really mindful of what you're asking and why. We can't put our own judgment on what we might consider unsafe, but if a young person is coming and saying, I need out of this housing arrangement because it's unsafe, we do have an obligation to figure out if there is an alternative safety plan, if there are legal protections we need to pull in, and particularly if there is a pathway through the domestic violence services that might keep them safer than the homelessness response system. In the state of Connecticut, we have kind of a differential response where if somebody has identified themselves as being involved in domestic violence or in sex trafficking, we actually put them through a coordinated process. Through domestic violence, they're still eligible for services through our housing continuum, but we really want to address that safety first. And again, we don't want to assume that because someone is in an unsafe living situation that there's not other options. We really want to kind of lift our heads out of the immediate housing crisis with all populations and really make sure that we're looking at what are the other options, who might we be able to speak with to facilitate something safe, and even something that's temporarily a diversion plan buys us a little bit of time to come up with a larger safety plan or a larger housing plan. So we're responding not only to folks that come to us in the moment of crisis, but also planning ahead a little bit on what are the options that are available to them, keeping in mind that a young person may have community resources, family and friends that are able to provide them some resources that we haven't necessarily taken the time to confer with them about what that might look like. We don't want to lead to the conclusion that shelter is the only option, especially if someone is unsafe. Next slide. So ultimate goals of diversion are really diverting more people than we enter into shelter, not by denying access, but by providing connections to supports in the community that can meet a specific need. And that's really, I think, really important, and usually the more controversial piece of this. We're not in the business of resolving poverty. That's really beyond the scope of the homelessness response system. So we really want to be, I think, really strength-based when we say that somebody's not eligible for shelter entry, right? That's a positive thing. You have some resources, and how can we facilitate your connection to those resources so that we are making sure that there's community connections in place and that young people have a path in front of them, have some identifiable next steps. And I will say that, we don't frame somebody returning to the system that was diverted as necessarily a bad thing. What we've seen is folks that we've been working to divert, if they do end up needing to enter shelter, their plans fall through, they have a literal need, they're usually exiting shelter a little quicker. They have already been thinking through some resources. They maybe have already started the job searching. There's a lot of evidence to show that even if somebody, their diversion plan falls through, we don't want to necessarily view that as a failure. And I appreciate that Kay had brought that up. I think when we're talking about how to do diversion, we have to really acknowledge that it takes a specific skill set to do this work. This is an entry level. You need to be quick thinking. You need to be creative. You need to be engaged with your community partners. You need to be pretty personable and non-judgmental and able to make young people feel comfortable right off the bat. And to really train folks to do diversion, again, should be throughout your crisis response system, but it really does require ongoing training and supervision. There is still, an attitude shift that accompanies diversion, and a lot of folks feel like if someone comes to us for shelter, that we have kind of an obligation to shelter them. And so this is really looking at, I actually give young people a little more credit than that. Youth are really resilient, and there's certainly some brain development pieces that mean they might need some help having some of these conversations. We might need to model some conflict mediation. But the general assumption for really successful diversion is not that young people need shelter. There certainly are going to be young people that need shelter. We want to make sure we're sheltering those young people as quickly as possible. But really, there needs to be a strong understanding and attitude among folks that are doing this work that there might be other options out there, and that we want to be as safe and mindful about all of the different considerations, and that really it's a dialogue between us and the young person to come up with a plan. And that plan, it might fall through, and that is really just sometimes the way it is, and it doesn't mean that the system is failing. Next slide. And I really want to touch on about community connection. I spoke in the last presentation I did about the Yeti and some of the work that I've done locally in Greater New Haven, and the state at large has really adapted around increasing our community relationships, not just for the purpose of diversion, but also really extending into that prevention piece. So we want to really know if somebody has vulnerabilities, if they need a resource. Any staff, not just diversion staff, any staff, really should know who's my point of contact at what agency, who's eligible, what docs do they need, how do I get a young person connected to that resource as quickly as possible. Because again, we're wanting to create community connections and investments in these young people through these resources, whether they're formal or informal. And it's, my biggest pet peeve is like the handout with resources on it. I think it's really important to model for young people that we're working to support them. And if they take the time to come to an appointment with me, that I can take the time and facilitate a meeting for them with my community colleague who can do some employment work with them. And I think that really enhances follow through, which enhances the success of diversion programs. And ways that we've really been able to capitalize that in our community is that we've been facilitating community partnerships through monthly meetings, through our HUD, mandated point in time counts, through, right now we're in the middle of a 100-day challenge here in Connecticut. We're continually pulling in community providers that care about homelessness and have a resource to offer. And we keep them in the loop about these things, these projects that are going on, ways that we can really utilize them, and identifying specific point of contact at community agencies that provide services that youth can access has really been a huge success for us and something that we're building. We really want to make sure that, and this will be ongoing work for every community, we really want to make sure that if a youth can identify a barrier that they need a resource with, if it in any way can improve their quality of life, increase their stability in the place that they're living, we want to make sure that we're making that as easy as possible for them to access. And in the end, everyone wins. The young person who receives the services, the program that's providing the service, and us as good, diversion workers. We really, to me, I view diversion as good case management. As Kate said, it's not necessarily a specific program. I do really try to delineate that it is different from shelter, because I think for a long time with coordinated entry, diversion was kind of just a thing you did, and it was kind of you either were diverted or you entered shelter. I think it's a little more nuanced than that. But we really want to be focusing on good comprehensive case management and case managers that are comfortable going above and beyond to provide connections to resources, and are also really trusting resources in the community to step up where the homelessness response system is just not appropriate. Next slide. And so kind of continuing on with additional considerations here, we've talked a little bit about, flexible funding. I think certainly flexible funding is a great carrot, and we definitely can use flexible funding to help with security deposit, to help with back rent. But more often than not, we're using that to support young people within their family system. We're not necessarily using that to help young people get their own apartment. That's not always what happens. So it is important to think of when you're thinking of applying for funding. It's not used as often as you would think. It is certainly nice to have. But this idea that you need a pot of money to do diversion, as Kay mentioned, it's really just not the case. And just to touch base on the concept of triage and in working with unsheltered youth, diversion is really important when we're working with unsheltered youth, but sometimes you don't have that immediate response of what the alternative options are because you have somebody who has a literally homeless presentation and you just want them to be safe and get services and get a shower and a meal and a bed to sleep in. And so if your agency or your community has the opportunity to employ triage, it can be a really important tool to keep a young person safe and really kind of close to the vets while you're working on a diversion plan. I know I've utilized triage a lot when I'm working with safe relocation out of town. It sometimes takes a minute to get the funds pulled together and to confirm the safe relocation and to get a train ticket and what have you. So having a triage space can be very useful in those situations where someone can maybe go either way. You want to keep them safe. You don't want someone to be turned away. And, we really want to just underscore this idea of positive youth development and really the obligation to respond to youth in a housing crisis is really a community's response. And so you won't be able to do it alone with your housing providers. You really gonna need to swim upstream and make sure that you have folks in every sector, education, employment, really skilled in assessing homelessness, knowing what to talk about with a young person who's in a crisis, and make sure that you're working all together on the same goal and that everybody is buy-in on keeping a young person safe and stably housed when at all possible with community supports and family and friends, rather than pushing the homelessness response system. So that's it for me. I think we can move it to questions.
Super. Thank you so much, Caitlin, for an incredible overview of implementing diversion, what it looks like in practice. We have so many great questions. We are running a little bit late. I'm going to, if Kay and Caitlin can stay for just a couple of minutes so we can get to at least a couple of questions that the most people had, and I'll get started on those. For everyone else, we will make sure that our panelists get answers to your questions, and answers will be coming in the newsletter following this webinar. If you've ever signed up for a Rappareed Housing for Youth Learning Community webinar, congratulations, you're on the mailing list for the newsletter and you'll get that. So for Kay and Caitlin, the big question that came up from the most attendees was about these connections to mainstream resources, these warm handoffs. A lot of people had versions of questions about what are you talking about when you say those things? What's an example of what that looks like? So Caitlin, I think you can talk specifically about what happens when you're making connections to mainstream resources or community resources rather than young people coming into shelter. And then Kay, if you have some examples from communities that are doing good diversion and connecting folks. Caitlin, do you want to go first? What does that look like, that actual warm handoff, that connection to community resources?
Yeah, sure. So if a young person is looking for services, and we're doing a whole overview of kind of what have you been working on, right? Like what has your life been looking like? Where have you been staying? Do you work? Do you go to schools? Do you have mental health services you engage in? We're going to want to pull in any community provider that they're currently working with to make sure that we're not creating a plan in a silo. So we ask to sign releases. We might ask to call folks. It really depends on the client and it depends on the plan. But if somebody says that they are staying somewhere, but they're not going to be able to stay much longer, if they pay their own rent, we might be looking at, can we talk to your landlord and come up with a rent payment plan? Can we come up with a rent repayment plan? If it is a family member, sometimes it's as simple as I can't continue to feed them. It's a financial burden. There's lights, there's gas, there's food. I can't pay for this all. We might be looking at coming up with a plan there. If it's something around long-term, somebody needs employment or has been having trouble, like if they have a child and they've been having difficulty with childcare and that's been a barrier to work, we're wanting to make contact on behalf of that young person to facilitate that connection to resources. And so again, it's really a work in progress in my community, but that's something that we work towards. We want to know who works in what system so that we can call together with the young person and say, hi, I'm working with this young person. They have a job. They are eligible for childcare, right? They probably meet the income requirements. We're having trouble getting connected. And ideally, if that community partner knows about the Yeti, knows about the work we're doing, knows about the coordinated entry system at large, they have an investment in wanting to reply and help you out. So we're not necessarily leaving that to the young person to have to do on their own. We're happy to make those connections, especially if it feels like that'll help mitigate some of the crisis feeling that's happening. But it's really just making sure that the conversation that's happening between you and a young person doesn't necessarily just stay between you and a young person, that we're signing releases or we're calling around to be as helpful as we can, while also not taking the young person's agency away. There's certainly things that young people can take with and run, but we want to make it as easy as possible. And we can't really do that in a vacuum.
Thank you. Kay, how about some specific examples from other good communities that are doing innovative diversion and connecting folks to different mainstream resources?
So everything that Caitlin said, and then, but I like, it can be things as specific as like food insecurity. So I think Caitlin had in her slide, you don't just give a list. So you don't give somebody a list. A warm handoff is not just giving somebody a list of food banks. It's literally trying to figure out, can we leverage enough from the food banks? I've seen communities that, know that, okay, well, this food bank, doesn't, take people that just walk in. They need to have a referral or something ahead of time. But it's picking up the phone and saying, I've got a crisis here, and, using sort of your leverage with the person within a food bank, or even creating the kind of plan where, let's look at the food bank system and figure out, okay, who does Mondays and who does Tuesdays and who's open here. And I've seen, and I talk about the food a lot because I think a lot of times, sometimes that's one of the biggest things, that it's a strain on resources for households. And it might be even, if a person is staying with somebody else. And so another example I've seen, so somebody's staying with somebody else and they're just, sort of there underfoot a lot, and it feels like, they're sleeping on the sofa, and that household doesn't mind them sleeping on the sofa, but it's just the idea that that person's underfoot because they haven't found their job yet. And, then they're just sort of there for all the meals, and helping them to sort of think through how to give somebody some freedom. And so are there food programs, are there meal programs in the community that you could like help that person connect with, some church groups that are giving meals that they wouldn't be underfoot all the time, at the dinner table if that family wants to, sort of have a dinner time, and, just to give a little space, because bringing two households together, even if it's, two youth, some or several youth together, folks still need their space. Those of us remember, college and roommates. I mean, there were just times that I just needed to get, away from my roommate when I was in college. And so even if you're in that situation where you're the extra person, trying to help that person think through specifics, and then even like checking with those resources to make sure that they are available and calling that. And I've also seen folks that will like, you schedule an appointment while that person's there, like have them use the phone, help them think through how they want to present it. So it's not like just giving them the phone number and saying, we'll call this place later, but actually facilitating that. So I think all of that is very similar to the kinds of stuff that Caitlin was saying, but that's sort of like taking it down to specifics of a situation. Does that help?
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Kay. Again, I'm mindful of everyone's time, so I don't want to keep folks, but we've got lots of really great, thoughtful questions. We are going to make sure that I and our two panelists are able to answer your questions and respond to you directly, either through email or in the newsletter itself with some of these great questions. And I'm going to just really quickly now cover next steps for the learning community this year. We're going to have even more online learning opportunities, of course. As I mentioned before, we've heard from learning community members that this year they'd really like to focus more on systems level, deep dive issues rather than on the very basic stuff about youth wrap rehousing. So we'll continue to feature those topics in upcoming webinars, along with other really exciting things for me anyway, like Housing First for Youth or being youth-led in wrap rehousing programs. So lots of great stuff. I can't wait to see you all back here for the next online meeting. Do be on the lookout for the upcoming Learning Community newsletter. It'll have the dates and times and registration information for the next online meeting, along with other resources, particularly about diversion this time, to improve the systemic response to youth homelessness in your community. Thank you, everybody.